You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, I do not know that Rudy Giuliani could have gotten worse news than he just got today. What just happened in court?
Yeah, a bankruptcy judge threw out his attempt to win the protections of bankruptcy. And guess what? He, in theory, will have to start shelling out the $148 million that he owes to the two Georgia state election workers who he defamed, Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman. So things really did go from bad to so much worse for Rudy Giuliani. You know, here is just a little bit of what the presiding bankruptcy judge, Sean Lane, said. He said that Rudy Giuliani failed to meet the obligations of financial transparency that are required of a debtor, somebody who's trying to win the protections of a bankruptcy court. So the judge is basically saying, Rudy, you can't even be trusted to talk honestly and credibly and accurately about your own assets and debts, so I'm tossing out your attempt to win the protections of bankruptcy. You know, this is really good news, though, for those two Georgia state election workers that, you know, Rudy Giuliani not only lied about, not only defamed, but put in extreme danger because he inspired so many attacks on Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss. So this is a really bad day for Rudy, but a really good day for them.
Glenn, can you explain to me here, because as far as I knew, the judgment, the $148 million judgment, wasn't dischargeable in bankruptcy. So even if he was able to declare bankruptcy, wouldn't he still have had to pay them that $148 million that he owed?
So not dischargeable, meaning he would still ultimately be required to pay it. But I do believe it kind of brings everything to a stop, at least while the bankruptcy case is proceeding. So what this does now that the bankruptcy case is tossed out, it gives the debtors, most notably Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman, it gives them the immediate opportunity to use all of the legal vehicles that they have at their disposal to, for example, seize Rudy Giuliani's, I think, multi-million-dollar apartment and seize or attach any other assets he might have. I think that was on hold during the pendency of the bankruptcy case. So true that those obligations wouldn't be discharged in bankruptcy, but this allows those two women to move forward in their collection efforts.
Okay, so basically Giuliani was trying the Trump tactic of just stalling as much as he possibly could so that he didn't have to actually be held to account for the crimes that he was found to be guilty of. And so now kind of it eliminates that process and they can just move forward.
Yes, both stalling and lying. He was using both Trump tactics.
That's right. Well, this raises the obvious question here. I know that you mentioned, for example, the apartment, the multi-million-dollar apartment that Giuliani has, but what if he simply doesn't have the money to satisfy that $148 million judgment, which does seem to be the case?
Yeah, I mean, the old saying is you can't get blood from a stone, and the truth is if he doesn't have enough assets to satisfy all of the money judgments against him or all of the debts he owes to other debtors, and there were other debtors who were involved in this bankruptcy proceeding, and interestingly, some of them wanted the bankruptcy case to continue, but the reporting is that Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman were advocating that the bankruptcy case be tossed out, I believe in part because of Rudy's ongoing deception, including to the court. But no, the reality is I don't believe any of Rudy's debtors will ultimately be made whole. So there will still be some people left kind of holding Rudy's debt, indefinitely because, like we say, you can't get blood from a stone.
Right. And I think it's important to note, too, that some of the debtors are also the U.S. government and his own lawyers, because he hasn't paid his lawyers for legal work that he hired them to do. Where does that sound familiar from? And also, he hasn't paid taxes to the U.S. government, so he owes the government money as well.
Yeah, and I think he owes something like $500,000 in taxes. I think his lawyer sued him for more than $1 million in back legal fees. I mean, this man is so irredeemable at this point. He's lawless. He doesn't make good on his debts. It really, I would say it's an incredible fall from grace, but I would say, Brian, I was one of those people who really never had a lot of confidence in Rudy Giuliani, even back when he was mayor of New York. I think but for 9/11 and but for people looking to rally around somebody, I think he was not performing all that well before that fateful day when those planes hit the Twin Towers.
Glenn, do you think now that Donald Trump has an opportunity to be a true friend to his longtime ally and someone for whom their involvement ultimately led to Giuliani's situation that he's in right now, do you think that Donald Trump is going to be a true friend and allow him some lodging over in Mar-a-Lago or Trump Tower?
Well, loyalty is pretty much Donald Trump's middle name, right? Who has he been disloyal to? Oh, wait a minute. He's been disloyal to everybody. So, might he throw another fundraiser? Recall some months ago, he did throw a fundraiser at Bedminster, his New Jersey golf club, for Rudy, charging whatever it was, $100,000 a plate. I don't know, maybe he'll bring Rudy on as, housekeeping staff down at Mar-a-Lago. But listen, The reality is I don't expect Donald Trump to lift a finger for Rudy Giuliani.
Right. And by the way, that's been a pattern that we've seen over and over and over again. You have someone like Ronna McDaniel, for example, who was so on the Trump train that she literally changed her name in deference to Donald Trump because he doesn't like Mitt Romney. She took Romney out of her name. And what did Donald Trump do? He unceremoniously discredited her and made sure that she no longer was the RNC chair. Even though the whole reason that she oversaw losses at the RNC, by the way, was because all of the losses that she oversaw were because those Republicans had aligned themselves closely, not with Ronna McDaniel, but with Donald Trump himself. And then you look at how Donald Trump has discarded Michael Cohen, George Papadopoulos. The list goes on and on of people who once had been in his inner circle. I mean, Michael Cohen was his own fixer, and then he came out and said that he only did a very small amount of legal work. Gordon Sondland, his longtime ambassador and campaign donor, he says he hardly knew him. So, this pattern of Donald Trump basically having somebody near him until the moment they lose their usefulness and then he discards them as unceremoniously as possible is a long-standing tradition as far as he's concerned.
Yeah, and something else to keep an eye out for. We don't know whether Donald Trump ever pardoned Rudy Giuliani, and I maintain there are some pocket pardons out there that we have yet to learn about. We will learn about any pardons Donald Trump delivered that were not made public once people are indicted federally, because remember, in Donald Trump's criminal prosecution in D.C., there are 6 unindicted co-conspirators who are listed in that indictment by act, though not by name. We sort of know who they are, and one of them is Rudy Giuliani. So the question will answer itself at some point. Was Donald Trump loyal enough to his former lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, that he gave him a pardon as Trump was on his way, out the door of the presidency? That's something that we'll probably learn about in the not too distant future.
If he did have a pardon, when would that be exposed?
So I assume there's no blueprint here because these secret pardons have not really been much of a thing, though there is no legal requirement, people need to know, for a pardon to be made public when the president decides to grant the pardons. And if you'll remember, during the January 6th House Select Committee public hearings, we heard Jared Kushner saying, listen, I was working overtime just getting all these pardons together and out the door before, my father-in-law left the presidency. So there is no answer to the timing question. When should somebody who is in receipt of a pardon disclose to the prosecutors that he has one? I would say the most likely moment you would see somebody pull a pocket pardon out of their back pocket would be right after the person was criminally indicted. Because before they're indicted, their lawyers are always working mightily to try to convince the prosecutors not to indict them. But once they're indicted, that is probably when the pardon would be produced, and then the litigation is on. And, there are some schools of thought that involve challenging in court a corruptly delivered pardon. The problem becomes the Supreme Court just made the pardon power almost untouchable, absolute. Donald Trump could literally sell pardons, and his radical right-wing justices on the Supreme Court have basically said, yep, we are now monarchy light, and whatever the president does is good to go.
One more reason to make sure that Donald Trump himself, who would be able to avail himself of that newfound power, doesn't get anywhere near the White House. But in the meantime, while we're on the topic of houses, it remains to be seen what Giuliani is going to do with his, given this new news. So, of course, we'll stay on top of this, as well as the other prosecutions for the rest of these Trump world folks and Donald Trump himself. So for those watching right now, if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.